اسمي إبراهيم خليل. كان والدي إمام أكبر مسجد في منطقتنا.
My name is Ibrahim Khalil. My father was the Imam of the largest mosque in our district. His voice was the first sound the neighborhood heard every morning before the sun had finished rising. His name was spoken with a particular kind of respect in every home on our street. The respect that attaches itself to men who carry the weight of an entire community's faith on their shoulders without appearing to buckle under it. When he walked through the market, men stopped what they were doing to greet him, not out of obligation, out of something genuine, because there was a quality in his presence that made people feel that God was paying attention, and that being near him was a way of being near that attention. Growing up as his son was like growing up inside a glass house. Every movement visible, every choice a reflection not only on me, but on him, on our family, on the community that had built its understanding of itself, partly around the figure of my father and what his household looked like from the outside. I did not resent this as a child. I was proud of it. Genuinely proud in the way a boy is proud when his father is a man that other men look toward. I wanted to be what my father was. Not to replace him, to continue him. I studied with him every night after dinner, sitting at the table in his study, while the rest of the house settled into its evening quiet. Arabic grammar, the rules of proper Quranic recitation, the principles of Islamic jurisprudence, and how they were applied to the actual complicated situations that real people brought to my father's door with their faces carrying whatever it had cost them to come. He was a patient teacher, precise in everything. He had no tolerance for carelessness, but enormous patience for genuine effort. He would say, "The difference between a man who knows something and a man who understands it is the willingness to ask the question underneath the question." I thought I understood what he meant when he said that. I was 15. I did not understand at all. I would not understand until I was standing in a storage room in the back of his mosque holding a book I was not supposed to have found, with the street traffic coming faintly through the high window above my head, trying to understand what question I had just been given access to. The mosque was my second home in the literal sense. I knew every room, every corridor, every particular combination of smell that belonged to different parts of the building at different times of day. The warm, dusty sweetness of the main prayer hall in the afternoon, when the sun came through the high windows at the right angle, the cool stone of the ablution area, the particular layered smell of the Imam's study, incense and paper, and the specific warm dryness of books that have been read many times. I was permitted to go anywhere in the building. My father had never told me any part of the mosque was off limits to his son. I think he liked having me there. I think the sound of his son's footsteps moving through the building was, for him, a form of continuity. Proof that what he had built would outlast him. I was 15 when I found the Bible. It was in the storage room behind the maintenance area, a room that held old prayer mats that had been replaced but not yet disposed of, boxes of supplies for the children's classes, cleaning materials, a broken cabinet that had been waiting to be repaired for what looked like several years. I had gone back there to find a specific box of Quran bookmarks for an event my father was organizing. I was moving things around, and behind a stack of rolled prayer mats that had not been disturbed in a long time, my hand found it. Small, green cover, slightly faded, no title visible from the angle I first saw it. I thought it was an old commentary. I pulled it out. The spine was soft with use. Someone had read this book many times, over many years. I opened it. My hands went still. I knew what it was immediately. I had been taught to recognize it the way you are taught to recognize certain symbols that require a specific response. I stood in the back of my father's mosque holding a New Testament, with the street sounds coming faintly through the window, and I could not move. I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment, not the warmth that some people describe when they first encounter these scriptures. What I felt first was confusion. And underneath the confusion, something I recognized from my studies of Quranic interpretation. That particular quality of alertness that comes when you sense that you are standing at the edge of something that will require more from you than you initially expected. I put the book back exactly where I had found it. I found the bookmarks I was looking for. I walked back through the mosque and helped my father set up for the evening prayer as if nothing had happened. But I could not stop thinking about it. I went back the next day, and the day after. Each time I sat in the back of that storage room with the New Testament in my lap and read for as long as I dared, my back against the cold stone wall, my ears tuned to every sound. the side door. Footsteps on the tile. My father's particular gait, which I could identify from 50 meters even through walls. I started in the Gospel of Luke. I cannot tell you exactly why Luke rather than another. Something drew me there in the way that certain things draw you before you understand why. The first parable that made me stop and read the same passage 4 times in a row was the story of the prodigal son. A young man who takes his inheritance early and leaves and wastes everything, and ends up in a foreign country, doing work that his tradition designated as the lowest possible. And in that place, the text says, he came to himself, meaning he had been somewhere else for a while, and then he found himself again. He decides to return home, not expecting welcome, expecting employment at the lowest possible level because he forfeited the right to be received as a son and knows it. But the father sees him from a long way off. The text uses a specific phrase that I have returned to hundreds of times since that afternoon in the storage room. While he was still a great way off, his father saw him and had compassion and ran. The father ran, not walked, not waited at the door with arms crossed for the son to arrive and present his speech of repentance, and then decided what to do next. The father saw him while he was still far away, and he ran toward him. Before the speech, before any accounting of what had been done with the inheritance, before any corrected behavior, he ran because he saw his son, and the seeing was enough. In my tradition, God was just, merciful, always described as merciful, but in proportion. You accumulated mercy through obedience. You accumulated it through practice and discipline, and the careful management of your conduct over a lifetime. You could lose it through sin. You restored it through contrition and the correction of behavior. Mercy was a response to something you did. It had conditions. It operated within a structure. The father in this story ran before the son said anything, before the speech, before the corrected behavior. He ran while the son was still at a distance because he saw him. And that was the whole of the theology. The son was his son, and nothing else in the accounting mattered because the relationship was prior to the accounting. The love was not a reward for performance. It was the ground on which everything else stood. I read that parable 4 times. I closed the book and sat with my hands completely still and tried to locate myself in relation to what I had just encountered. I could not. I was disoriented in the way that you are disoriented when a map you have been navigating by turns out to be missing significant features, and you are now standing in a landscape that should be empty according to the map, and is clearly, visibly, not empty at all. 3 weeks after I first found the book, I did something I had never done in my life. I asked my father a question he did not expect. We were sitting after the evening prayer. The house was quiet. He was reading. I said, "Baba, what do you think is the greatest difference between Islam and Christianity?" He looked up. His face did not immediately change, but something in his eyes did. A sharpness. The kind that comes when a man who is very good at reading situations recognizes that a conversation is not what it appears to be on its surface. He asked why I was asking. I told him I had heard classmates discussing it at school. He was quiet for longer than usual. Then he said something I have thought about every day since that evening. He said, the Christian God loves without condition. That is the central difference, and that is why it cannot be true. A God who loves without condition is a God without justice, and a God without justice is not God at all. He went back to his book. I went to my room and sat on my bed in the dark for a very long time, because the argument my father had made was internally coherent. It was theologically defensible. It was the kind of clean, rigorous thinking he had spent years teaching me to apply to every question I encountered. A God without justice would be a God without meaning. Justice is part of the structure. Remove it, and the architecture collapses. And yet, the father in the story had run, and the running had not looked like the absence of justice. It had looked like the most honest and recognizable thing I had ever read in a religious text. It had looked like the thing that every human being in every story they have ever told about their relationship with God has always, at the deepest level, been hoping was true. Not earned acceptance, not conditional welcome. Just a father who sees his child from a distance and runs toward him because the child is his child, and that is the whole of it. I was 17 when my father found out. Not about my reading specifically. Not in the way I had feared. What happened was this. I went to the storage room one day and the book was gone. In its place was a classical Arabic commentary on the Quranic verses relating to the nature of Jesus, placed there with a deliberateness that could not have been accidental. And on top of the commentary, a single handwritten note, in my father's handwriting. It said in Arabic, "Whoever placed this here has already been forgiven, but it must not be found again." I stood in that room for a very long time. My father had found the Bible before I had, and he had not destroyed it. He had moved it, and he had left a note that said whoever placed it had been forgiven. Not condemned, not reported, forgiven. I did not know what to make of that. I have turned it over many times since. Had my father placed it there himself? Had he found it placed by someone else and chosen to protect the person who had left it? Had he read it? Had it done to him something of what it was doing to me? What I know is that by the time I found the note, I had already obtained my own copy. Through a classmate whose family I had not known were secret believers until the day he pressed a small book into my hand in the school hallway and said, "I think you have been looking for this." His name was Daniel. Quiet, watchful, with the particular careful awareness of someone who has learned to exist in two worlds simultaneously, without letting either one see the other. We had shared classes for 3 years and spoken a handful of times. I have never understood how he knew, but he found me at exactly the moment I needed to be found. I read the entire New Testament over the following 2 months. I read it the way my father had taught me to read a text that deserved serious engagement, carefully, repeatedly, in dialogue with everything I already knew and believed. I was not looking to be convinced of something. I was looking to understand, and what I found as I read was not a set of arguments, but a person. Jesus moved through the pages of those 4 Gospels in a way that was unlike any figure I had encountered in religious literature. He was not primarily a lawgiver. He was not primarily a teacher, though he taught. He was someone whose primary activity seemed to be finding people who had been told they were outside the category of the reachable and reaching them anyway. Women that polite society had designated as outside the range of respect. Men whose professions excluded them from religious community. People inhabited by things they had not chosen. Children who were being dismissed by his own disciples until he stopped and turned and said, "Let them come." And he looked at them with an attention so complete that it changed them. Not by argument, by seeing. I was 18 when my father looked at me across the dinner table one evening and said quietly, without any preamble at all, "You have been reading the Christian scriptures." My mother put down her cup. My younger sister became very still. I did not deny it. I said yes. The silence that came after that single word was the most significant silence I have ever sat inside. Not because it was hostile. My father was not a man who expressed himself through hostility. The silence was significant because it was the silence of a man who had prepared himself for many possible conversations with his son and had not prepared for this one. He asked me what I had found in those scriptures that I had not found in what he had given me. That question stopped me completely. I had prepared for commands, for anger expressed in the controlled way of a man who has learned to keep his emotions in their proper places. I had not prepared for being asked. For my father, of all people, sitting across from me with that question in his eyes, I said, "The Father who runs." He looked at me for a long moment. And then he did something I had never seen him do. He nodded, slowly, once. The way a man nods when someone has given the answer to a question he already knew, but needed to hear spoken out loud by someone else. He did not speak again for the rest of the meal. That night, much later, when the house was dark and everyone had gone to bed, I heard him in his study. The light was on. The door was not quite closed. I heard the sound of pages turning. And then I heard something I had never heard from my father in my entire life. He was crying. Not loudly, barely audible. The kind of crying that comes from a man who has spent his entire adult life being the person other people brought their grief to, and who has never had practice allowing it for himself. The private, almost inaudible grief of someone who is finally, in the dark, alone, permitting himself to be small for the first time. I stood outside that door for a very long time. I did not knock. I did not know what I would have said. But I stood there, and I felt something move through me that was entirely new in the landscape of my relationship with my father. Not the dutiful love of a son who admires a man and wants to be worthy of him. Something older and less conditional. Compassion. For a man who had given me everything he knew how to give. Who had built me carefully and loved me in the specific way available to him. Who was now sitting in the dark with a question I had placed in his hands by saying 3 words. And who was reckoning with that question in the only way his particular honesty would allow. I was baptized in the home of a believer 6 months later. later. 7 people present.
No ceremony designed for an audience. Water and a question, and my answer, and the experience of coming up from under it into an air that felt, in a way I cannot explain rationally, different. Not the air itself. Something in the relationship between me and the air. Something had been settled. Something that had been in motion for a very long time had come to rest. I told my father formally a month after that, and I want to say plainly that he did not speak to me for 3 weeks.
The story did not immediately resolve into reconciliation. Real stories rarely do. He needed time to hold something that had no place in the framework of his life. He needed to grieve what he understood to be losing before he could see what he might be finding. At the end of the 3rd week, he came to my room. He sat in the chair by the window. He looked at his hands the way he looked at his hands when he was being precise about something important. He said, "I have been asking God since the night you told me what drew you to that book. I have been asking with everything I know how to bring to a question, and I have not received an answer that tells me you are wrong." I asked him what he meant. He said, "I found the book in the storage room 4 years before you did. I placed it there. I told myself I was keeping it to understand what I was supposed to defend against, but I read it, every word, twice. And the Father who runs has lived in my chest like a stone I cannot remove ever since that day." My father and I sat in my room that evening for 2 hours. We talked about things that fathers and sons in our tradition do not usually talk about. The questions underneath the questions. The weight underneath the certainty. The image in that parable that had found its way through all the theology and lived in both of us, without the other knowing, for years. I do not know where my father's faith stands today in terms of what he would declare publicly. He holds a role in a community that would be fractured by certain kinds of honesty. Our conversations about Jesus are private, careful, layered with the complexity of a man navigating something real inside a context that does not have a safe way for him to navigate it in the open. I respect that. I do not push. I wait. The way I have learned the Father in the story waited, not passively, but with the door open and his eyes on the road. But I know what he said to me the last time I left home. He was standing at the door, looking at the street beyond me, not at me, the way he looked at things when he was being most honest with them. He said, "The Father who runs. I think I have been running all my life, and I did not know toward what. I carried those words with me through every border I crossed afterward, through every new city and every new season of building a life in a place that did not already know who I was. I carry them still, because Jesus did not only find me in a storage room in the back of my father's mosque with a book that someone had hidden and someone else had found. He reached into the most locked room of my father's heart and left something there that 40 years of theology could not remove, and 4 years of deliberate not looking could not extinguish. The image of a father who does not wait at the door, who sees you from a long way off,
And who runs? If you are listening to this from inside a faith that has never asked you what you actually find there, if you have been given a God and have never been invited to ask whether what you have been given matches what you are looking for when you are honest about what you need, if there is a question underneath your question that you have never felt safe enough to ask out loud, I want to tell you what my father told me he had been carrying for 4 years inside the walls of his own mosque. The Father who runs is not a piece of foreign theology. He is the truth that every human heart has always been oriented toward, the love that does not wait for you to earn it.
the God who sees you from a great distance and does not stand there calculating what you deserve. He just runs.